Poirot and the Christmas Eve Disaster. A Parisian Mystery *, Part 1. Arrival in a city of lights and secrets. Hercule Poirot stood very still on the platform of the Gare du Nord, his gloved hands resting lightly upon the silver head of his walking stick. Around him, Paris moved with hurried elegance, porters calling out, steam sighing from the engines, ladies wrapped in fur stepping carefully across the damp stone. Snow fell in delicate, almost theatrical flakes, as though the city itself wished to perform for Christmas. Poirot frowned, not at the snow. He approved of snow when it behaved with order and symmetry, but at the disorder of human movement around him. Paris, he reflected, was beautiful, yes, but far too inclined toward chaos. Brussels understood restraint. London tolerated discipline. Paris flirted with excess. And yet, murmured Poirot softly to himself, it is precisely excess that makes it dangerous. He adjusted his immaculate moustache, ensuring each side mirrored the other perfectly, and allowed his valet, Georges, to finish arranging their luggage. Poirot had not intended to be in Paris for Christmas. Indeed, he had planned a quiet holiday in London, with well-prepared meals and minimal interruption. But then the letter had arrived, cream-colored paper, elegant handwriting, and a tone that suggested urgency without vulgar desperation. My dear Poirot, if you value discretion, intelligence, and the prevention of catastrophe, I beg you to come to Paris at once. Christmas Eve will not pass quietly. A friend. Poirot disliked vagueness. He disliked it intensely. And yet, the letter had stirred his curiosity, those little grey cells that never truly rested. The signature, though absent, was unnecessary. Poirot recognized the style. It belonged to Monsieur Armand Duval, a man of wealth, refinement, and secrets, far too many secrets, now. As Poirot stepped into the waiting motor-car, Paris revealed itself in festive splendor. Streets glowed with golden lights. Shop windows overflowed with ornaments, silk scarves, and delicate pastries. Church bells rang in the distance, promising peace, goodwill, and redemption. Poirot sighed. Christmas, he said. A time when people pretend they are good, and thus a most convenient time for evil. The Duval townhouse stood on a quiet street near the Seine, dignified and discreet behind Rothian gates. Its facade was adorned with evergreen garlands and white ribbons, tasteful rather than extravagant. Inside, warmth embraced Poirot immediately. Polished wood, the faint perfume of pine and expensive cologne. Monsieur Duval himself hurried forward, his smile wide but his eyes restless. Ah, my dear friend, you have come. I knew you would. Poirot allowed himself a brief, formal embrace. You summoned me with mystery, Armand, he said mildly. I do not like mystery without context. Duval laughed, a little too loudly. All will be explained. But first you must be tired. Poirot noted everything as he followed Duval into the grand salon, the placement of chairs, the servants' movements, the way Duval's wife avoided her husband's gaze. A Christmas tree stood proudly in the corner, its ornaments glittering like watchful eyes. Guests were already arriving. There was Madame Colette Moreau, a celebrated opera singer whose beauty was rivaled only by her reputation for dramatic scandals. Etienne Laurent, a young diplomat with impeccable manners and nervous hands. Colonel Henry Beaumont, retired military, rigid posture, eyes that missed nothing. Lucien Roche, an art dealer with a charming smile and a history of questionable ethics. And then there were the servants, silent, observant, underestimated. Poirot paid them particular attention. As introductions were made, Poirot felt it, an undercurrent of tension, subtle but unmistakable. Polite laughter arrived a moment too late. Smiles lingered too long. Conversations stopped abruptly when certain names were mentioned. Christmas. Music played softly in the background. Poirot accepted a glass of wine but did not drink it. Instead, he watched. Dinner was announced, and the guests moved into the dining room, where a long table gleamed beneath crystal chandeliers. Candles flickered. Snow tapped gently against the windows. "Perfection," said Madame Moreau, lifting her glass. "Paris at Christmas is perfection." Poirot smiled thinly. "Perfection," he replied, "is often an illusion." As courses were served, conversation turned to politics, art, and travel. Yet beneath the civilized exchange, Poirot sensed sharp edges. Colonel Beaumont stiffened at any mention of the past war. Laurent avoided Duval's gaze. Roach spoke easily, but his eyes calculated constantly. Then, midway through desert, a servant approached Duval and whispered something urgently into his ear. Duval paled. He rose abruptly. "My friends," he said, forcing a smile, "please excuse me for a moment." Poirot watched him leave and noted that Laurent followed moments later. Interesting, very interesting. Poirot rose as well, excusing himself politely. He moved quietly down the corridor, his footsteps muffled by thick carpets. Voices echoed faintly from Duval's study. "You said it would be safe," Laurent hissed. "I believed it was," Duval replied. "But if it is discovered..." Poirot stepped back before he could hear more. Secrets, he thought. Dangerous ones. He returned to the dining room just as a sudden cry rang out. A glass shattered. Madame Moreau clutched her throat, her face contorted in shock. She collapsed forward onto the table, candles toppling, wine spilling like blood across white linen. Chaos erupted. Someone screamed. A chair fell. Servants rushed forward. Poirot did not move. He simply closed his eyes for a brief moment. "So," he murmured, opening them again, "the disaster has begun." Part 2. The Christmas Eve disaster. For several seconds after Madame Moreau collapsed, no one seemed capable of movement. The dining room, so recently a picture of elegance, had transformed into a scene of confusion and fear. Candles flickered wildly, casting distorted shadows on the walls, while the scent of spilt wine mingled unpleasantly with perfume and panic. Poirot alone remained perfectly still. "Do not touch her," he said calmly, his voice cutting through the chaos like a blade through silk. Colonel Beaumont, who had half risen from his chair, froze at once. The servants hesitated. Even Monsieur Duval, pale and trembling, obeyed instinctively. Poirot stepped forward and knelt beside Madame Moreau. One glance was enough. Her lips were tinged faintly blue, her eyes staring, unseeing. "She is alive," Poirot announced, "but only just. We must act with intelligence, not hysteria." "Poison," whispered Etienne Laurent. Poirot looked up sharply. "You asked that very quickly, monsieur." Laurent flushed. "I only meant..." "Yes," said Poirot gently, "it is poison, and it was taken only moments ago." At his direction, servants were dispatched to fetch a doctor and to telephone the police. The reply came swiftly and grimly. Heavy snowfall had blocked several streets. Help would be delayed. "We are trapped?" Madame Duval asked faintly. "For the moment," Poirot replied. "Which is most convenient for the criminal. That word hung in the air like a curse. Madame Moreau was carried to a nearby sitting room and laid upon a sofa. Her breathing was shallow, uneven. Poirot examined the shattered glass on the dining table. Only one glass had broken, the one from which she had been drinking. Poirot lifted the remaining stem carefully, sniffed and frowned. "Almond," he said quietly to Duval. "This wine, was it served to all?" Yes, Duval stammered. "From the same bottle." "Then the poison was not in the bottle," Poirot concluded. "It was introduced later. Very precise. Very deliberate." Colonel Beaumont folded his arms. "Are you suggesting one of us did this?" Poirot met his gaze steadily. "I am suggesting nothing, Colonel. I am observing everything." Lucien Roche laughed nervously. "This is madness. A theatrical collapse during Christmas dinner. Surely it is some misunderstanding?" Poirot turned toward him. "Monsieur Roche, poison is rarely a misunderstanding." The guests were ushered into the salon while Poirot requested that no one leave the house. Doors were quietly locked. Curtains were drawn. Outside, Paris continued to celebrate Christmas Eve, unaware that inside the townhouse, goodwill had died. Poirot began his inquiries at once. "Let us be clear," he said, standing before the fireplace. "Until the police arrive, I assume responsibility. You will answer my questions truthfully. You will regret your imagination." No one objected. "Madame Moreau arrived at what time?" "Just before dinner," said Madame Duval. "She was in excellent spirits." Poirot nodded. "And during dinner, did anyone notice anything unusual?" There was a pause. Etienne Laurent spoke hesitantly. "She exchanged glasses with Monsieur Roche." "By accident," she said. Poirot's eyes sharpened. "Ah, an accident." Roche raised his hands. "She reached across the table, nearly knocked it over. I insisted it was no matter." Poirot smiled thinly. "Accidents are fascinating, monsieur. They often arrive by appointment." He turned to Colonel Beaumont. "Colonel, where were you seated?" "Opposite Madame Moreau." "And did you see anyone approach her glass?" "No," Beaumont replied stiffly. "But I was not watching her every moment." Poirot inclined his head. "No one ever is." A servant entered quietly and handed Poirot a small tray. On it lay a folded piece of paper. This was found beneath Madame Moreau's chair. The servant said. Poirot unfolded it carefully. His expression did not change, but his eyes grew colder. Written in elegant ink were the words, "Christmas. Eve will demand payment." Poirot folded the note and slipped it into his pocket. "Mesdames et messieurs," he said softly. This was no random act. This was a warning and, perhaps not the final one. Madame Duval gasped. "You mean, there may be another?" Poirot looked around the room slowly, meeting each face in turn. "Yes," he said. "I believe Madame Moreau was not the true target." At that moment, a faint moan drifted from the sitting room. Madame Moreau stirred. Poirot allowed himself a small, grim smile. "The disaster," he murmured, "has only begun." Part 3. A house full of suspects. Madame Moreau did not regain full consciousness that night. The doctor finally able to reach the townhouse despite the snow confirmed Poirot's suspicions. The poison was rare, slow-acting, and expertly administered. She would live, he said, but only because the dose had been small. Poirot repeated softly after the doctor departed. "Yes, deliberately small." The implication was chilling. The guests were gathered once more in the grand salon. The fire burned low now, its warmth unable to dispel the unease that clung to the room. Outside, the snow continued to fall, sealing the house off from the world. Christmas Eve had become a prison. Poirot stood near the mantelpiece, hands clasped behind his back. "Since we are confined together," he said calmly, "we shall use the time productively. I will speak with each of you, separately." No one objected. Fear had a way of encouraging cooperation. Monsieur Armand Duval was the first. He sat rigidly in a high-backed chair, his fingers twisting a handkerchief until it was little more than a rope. "You invited me here because you feared something," Poirot began. "Tell me what?" Duval swallowed. "I received threats, letters, anonymous. They spoke of debts from the past, financial." Duval hesitated. "Not entirely." Poirot leaned forward slightly. "Monsieur Duval, Christmas Eve poisonings do not arise from unpaid bills." Duval's voice dropped. "During the war, I was entrusted with certain documents, names, lists. Some people were exposed, others disappeared." Poirot nodded slowly. "And Madame Moreau?" "She knew," Duval whispered. "She always knew." Poirot thanked him and dismissed him gently. Madame Elise Duval. Madame Duval was composed, but her eyes betrayed exhaustion. "You loved your husband?" Poirot asked unexpectedly. She blinked. "Of course, and yet you avoid his gaze." She sighed. "Because I know what he hides, and because I fear what will come for us." Poirot studied her carefully. "Did you dislike Madame Moreau?" A pause. Then, quietly, "She enjoyed power over others, especially men." Poirot smiled faintly. "Power is often more intoxicating than wine." Etienne Laurent paced the room like a caged animal. "You followed Monsieur Duval earlier," Poirot said. "Why?" Laurent stopped. "Because I feared he would destroy something important." "What?" Laurent hesitated. "A document. One that could ruin careers, including mine." Poirot raised an eyebrow. "And yet it was Madame Moreau who drank the poison." "Yes," Laurent exclaimed. "Which proves I am innocent." Poirot's gaze hardened. "It proves nothing, monsieur, except that you are relieved." Colonel Henry Beaumont stood at attention even indoors. "You are a soldier," Poirot said. "You understand timing." "I understand duty," Beaumont replied coldly, "and revenge." Beaumont's jaw tightened. "Revenge is a luxury. Justice is not." Poirot nodded. "Where were you during dessert?" "Seated. Watching whom?" Beaumont hesitated. "Everyone." Poirot dismissed him with a slight bow. Lucien Rocheroche greeted Poirot with an easy smile that did not reach his eyes. "You deal in art," Poirot said. "And in secrets," Roche laughed. "Paris runs on both. You exchanged glasses with Madame Moreau. An accident." Poirot leaned closer. "Monsieur Roche, accidents require opportunity." "You had it?" Roche's smile faltered. "You have no proof?" Poirot straightened. "Not yet. The servants last, came the servants, the cook, the maid, and a quiet young footman named Julien." Poirot's attention lingered on the boy. "You were near the table often," Poirot observed. "Yes, monsieur. You noticed things others did not." Julien hesitated, then nodded. Madame Moreau's glass was moved. "Not by her." Poirot's eyes gleamed. "By whom?" Julien swallowed. I could not see clearly, but it was a man's hand. Poirot placed a gentle hand on the boy's shoulder. You have helped greatly. As the questioning ended, Poirot returned to the salon alone. He gazed at the Christmas tree, its ornaments glittering innocently. So many motives, he murmured. So many lies. And yet only one truth. From upstairs came the faint sound of footsteps. Poirot turned sharply. Someone was moving through the house, and they did not wish to be seen. Part 4. Clues in the shadows of Paris. The sound of footsteps above the salon was faint, almost apologetic, but to Poirot it rang louder than any alarm. He did not rush. Rushing was for policemen and amateurs. Instead, he waited, listening, allowing his mind to arrange possibilities with calm precision. Then he moved. The staircase curved upward in dignified silence, its banister polished by decades of careful hands. Poirot ascended slowly, his eyes taking in every detail: the position of doors, the faint mark of damp footprints on the carpet, the subtle disturbance of air that suggested a door had recently been opened at the end of the corridor. Light flickered beneath the door of Monsieur Duval's study. Poirot knocked once. No answer. He opened the door. The study was empty, but it had not been so moments before. The fire burned low in the grate. Papers lay scattered across the desk, not in chaos, but in haste. Poirot approached and examined them without touching. Most were harmless. Correspondence, financial records, invitations. But one drawer stood open, its interior bare. Something is missing, Poirot murmured. A faint metallic sound caught his attention. On the mantelpiece lay a pocket watch. Its glass was cracked, and its hands were frozen at 11:47 p.m. Poirot frowned. Time, he said softly, is always the most honest witness. He slipped the watch into his pocket just as footsteps echoed again, this time retreating. Poirot smiled thinly. Downstairs, the guests remained gathered, speaking in low, anxious tones. Poirot re-entered the salon as though nothing had occurred. Monsieur Poirot, Madame Duval asked nervously, "Did you find something?" "Yes," Poirot replied. "And also, someone." A ripple of unease passed through the room. "But," he continued smoothly, "we will speak of that later." He turned to Colonel Beaumont. "Colonel, you were in the army during the occupation of Paris, were you not?" "I was," Beaumont replied stiffly. "And you carried a watch like this?" Poirot produced the broken watch. Beaumont's eyes widened for a fraction of a second, then hardened. "Many men did, indeed," Poirot said, "but not many break at exactly 11:47. Beaumont said nothing. Poirot requested permission to inspect the rest of the house. None refused. With the help of Julian, the footman, he examined corridors, guest rooms, and service passages, behind a tapestry in the west wing. Poirot discovered a narrow door. "Aha," he said softly. The passage beyond was old, unused, and dusty, yet recent footprints disturbed the floor. It led toward the rear of the house, emerging near the servants' quarters. "Convenient," Poirot observed. "Very convenient." Julian shifted uneasily. "Monsieur, I did not know this existed." "Of course not," Poirot replied kindly. "Secrets are designed to be forgotten." Later that night, Poirot stepped briefly outside into the snow-covered courtyard. Paris lay hushed beneath white silence. From the distance came the muted sound of church bells. Midnight had passed. Christmas Day had begun. Poirot bent down and brushed snow aside near the gate. There, half buried, lay a small glass vial, empty. He held it up to the lantern light. The poison, he said quietly. Disposed of, but not destroyed. Footsteps crunched behind him. It was Lucien Roche, enjoying the night air. Roche asked lightly. Poirot turned. Monsieur Roche, do you often wander at midnight? Roche shrugged. Sleep eludes me. Poirot's eyes flicked briefly to Roche's shoes still damp with snow. Sleep, Poirot said softly, eludes many criminals. Roche's smile faded, back inside. Poirot gathered the guests once more. We have, he announced, a hidden passage, a missing document, a broken watch, and an empty vial. Madame Duval clasped her hands. What does it mean? Poirot looked around the room slowly, deliberately. It means, he said, that the crime is not confined to this house, and not to this night. The fire crackled outside. Paris celebrated Christmas. Inside, Poirot felt the tightening of the net. Part 5 lies, wrapped in festive cheer. Christmas morning arrived quietly, almost timidly, as though Paris itself hesitated to intrude upon the darkness that lingered inside the Duval townhouse. Pale winter light filtered through tall windows, illuminating garlands, extinguished candles, and the remnants of a celebration that had gone terribly wrong. Poirot had not slept. He sat alone in the small breakfast room, a cup of untouched coffee before him, his eyes half closed, not in fatigue, but in concentration. In his mind, the events of the previous night replayed again and again, each movement examined, each word weighed. Order, he murmured softly. There is always order, even in chaos. Footsteps approached. Julien, the young footman, entered hesitantly. Monsieur Poirot, he said, Madame Moreau is awake. Poirot opened his eyes at once. Ah, then Christmas has brought us a gift after all. Madame Moreau lay propped up in bed, her once commanding presence reduced but not extinguished. Her eyes, sharp even in weakness, fixed immediately on Poirot as he entered. So, she said faintly, the famous detective. Poirot bowed slightly. At your service, madame, and very relieved to see you alive. A thin smile touched her lips. Disappointed. Poirot chuckled. Never. Death complicates questioning. Her gaze flickered. You believe I was not meant to die? No, Poirot replied calmly. You were meant to be frightened. Madame Moreau closed her eyes briefly. Then the message was delivered. Poirot leaned forward. What message, madame? She studied him for a long moment. Christmas Eve, she whispered. A settling of accounts. Poirot nodded. And whose accounts were those? She turned her face away. I will say no more. Poirot straightened. You will, he said gently. But not yet. Downstairs, tension simmered beneath forced politeness. Breakfast was served, but few ate. Colonel Beaumont read the newspaper without turning a page. Lucien Roche paced near the window. Etienne Laurent stared into his cup as though it might confess something. Poirot entered the room. Madame et messieurs, he said, Christmas is a time for truth. Let us honor the tradition. Lucien Roche laughed shortly. You speak as though we are all guilty. Poirot's eyes met his. I speak as though one of you is. Silence followed. Poirot turned first to Laurent. Monsieur Laurent, you are a diplomat. You understand the value of documents. Laurent stiffened. Yes, and the danger of their disappearance. Yes. Poirot nodded. The missing document from Monsieur Duval's study did concern you. Laurent's voice trembled. It could have destroyed me. Yet you did not steal it, Poirot said. Laurent looked up sharply. You are certain? Yes, Poirot replied. Because you lack imagination. Laurent flushed, humiliated. Poirot turned next to Colonel Beaumont. Colonel, he said, you speak often of justice. Beaumont's jaw tightened. Someone must. And yet, Poirot continued, justice pursued without restraint becomes vengeance. Beaumont rose to his feet. Are you accusing me? Poirot shook his head. Not yet. Lucien Roche could no longer contain himself. This is absurd, he snapped. We are prisoners in this house, accused without proof. I demand the truth. Poirot interrupted softly. Roche froze. Poirot stepped closer. You sell art, monsieur. But last night you dealt in something far more valuable. Roche's eyes darted toward the door. The glass, Poirot said quietly. You switched it. That proves nothing. It proves opportunity, Poirot replied. An opportunity is the skeleton key of crime. Roche laughed bitterly. You have no witness. Poirot turned slightly. Julian. The young footman stepped forward, pale but resolute. I saw a man's hand move the glass. The sleeve was dark, like Monsieur Roche's jacket. Roche's face drained of colour. You little fool enough, Poirot said sharply. Roche sank into a chair, breathing hard, but Poirot continued. You are not the murderer. Roche looked up, stunned. You are, Poirot said. A thief. A murmur swept the room. Poirot raised a hand. The document was stolen to provoke fear, to draw attention, to create chaos. But the poisoner, that was something else. Madame Duval gasped. You mean to criminals? No, Poirot replied. One plan, two purposes. He walked to the Christmas tree and gently lifted an ornamentous small silver bell. Christmas decorations, he said, are excellent hiding places. From inside the bell, he removed a folded paper. The missing document, Monsieur Duval, collapsed into a chair. Poirot turned slowly back to the group. The poison was meant for another, he said, and the killer still walks among us. Outside, church bells rang. Poirot closed his eyes briefly. The lies, he murmured, are beginning to unravel. Asterisk, Part 6. Poirot's little grey cells, at work the revelation of the hidden document, did not bring relief. It brought something far more dangerous: confidence. Confidence, Poirot knew, was the enemy of criminals who believed themselves clever. Once a secret was exposed, the mind that had guarded it so carefully began to unravel. The Duval townhouse seemed quieter now, as though the walls themselves were listening. Poirot requested that everyone retire to separate rooms for a short time, not as prisoners, he explained mildly, but as thinkers. Reflection is most productive when one is alone. No one argued. Even Lucien Roche, pale and shaken, obeyed without protest. Poirot returned to the breakfast room and closed the door behind him. He removed his gloves carefully, placed them on the table, and sat. Before him lay the items he had collected: the broken watch, the empty vial, the threatening note, and the recovered document. He arranged them with precise symmetry. Now, he murmured, we think. He closed his eyes. Madame Moreau, the poison, the switched glass, the dosmol, deliberate. Not intended to kill. Why? Because death would have ended the game too quickly. The poison was a message. But to whom? Poirot opened his eyes sharply. To the true target. He rang for Julian. The boy entered nervously. "You are observant," Poirot said kindly. "Tell me last night who appeared most frightened after Madame Moreau collapsed." Julian thought carefully. Monsieur Laurent was shocked. Madame Duval cried. Monsieur Roche looked angry, but Colonel Beaumont looked disappointed. Poirot's eyes gleamed. Disappointed? Yes, monsieur. Like something had gone wrong. Poirot dismissed the boy gently. He rose and paced the room slowly, hands clasped behind his back. Colonel Beaumont. A man of discipline. A man of war. A man who believed in justice, and justice, when mixed with memory, often fermented into revenge. Poirot recalled Beaumont's words. Justice is not a luxury. No, Poirot whispered. It is an obsession. He summoned Colonel Beaumont next. The colonel entered stiffly, his posture rigid as ever. Sit. Colonel Poirot, said Beaumont, obeyed. You were in Paris during the occupation, Poirot began. Yes, you lost people. Beaumont's jaw tightened. We all did. Poirot nodded. But you lost them because of betrayal. Silence. Poirot leaned forward. Names were given. Lists. People disappeared. Beaumont's eyes darkened. Some deserved it. Poirot shook his head gently. No one deserves to be erased by cowardice. Beaumont rose abruptly. Be careful, monsieur. Poirot did not flinch. Madame Moreau knew those lists. Beaumont froze. She profited from them, Poirot continued. Power, influence, survival. Beaumont's voice was low. She always survived. And you, Poirot said softly, never forgot. Beaumont said nothing. Poirot dismissed him. Next came Etienne Laurent. Laurent was trembling now. His polished composure cracked beyond repair. You feared exposure, Poirot said. But you were not the target. Laurent nodded miserably. I was a coward. I followed orders. I signed papers. Poirot studied him. And you regret it? Yes, Laurent whispered. Poirot smiled faintly. Regret is not murder. Laurent was dismissed. Poirot then visited Madame Duval. You knew your husband's secrets, Poirot said, double quotes, yes, and Madame Moreau's role. Yes, Poirot watched her closely. You did not poison her. Madame Duval looked up sharply. You are certain? Yes, Poirot replied. Because you would have used a knife. She laughed weakly, then began to cry. Only one person remained. Madame Moreau herself. Poirot entered her room quietly. She was stronger now, colour returning slowly to her face. You are afraid, Poirot said gently. She smiled bitterly. For the first time in many years, you received the message. Yes. And you understood it. Yes. Poirot leaned closer. Who sent it? She closed her eyes. A ghost. Poirot shook his head. Ghosts do not poison wine. Her eyes opened. Colonel Beaumont. Poirot straightened. He warned me once, she continued weakly. Years ago. I laughed. Poirot nodded. And now? Now I listen. That evening, Poirot gathered everyone again in the salon. The poison, he announced, was not meant to kill Madame Moreau. Lucien Roche looked up sharply. Then why? Because death, Poirot interrupted, would have been mercy. A chill passed through the room. The true target, Poirot continued, was someone else. Someone who was meant to confess. Colonel Beaumont's eyes narrowed. The poison was a warning. The document was bait. The fear was the weapon. Poirot turned slowly toward Beaumont, and the second attempt, he said quietly, will not be so gentle. At that moment, a scream echoed from upstairs. Poirot spun toward the staircase. Too late, he murmured and ran. Part 7, a second attempter. Scream tore through the Duval townhouse, like a blade through silk. Poirot was already moving before the sound had fully faded. He ran not with panic, but with purpose, his short legs carrying him up the staircase faster than anyone would have believed possible. Behind him came the pounding footsteps of Colonel Beaumont, Lucien Roche, and Etienne Laurent, their faces pale masks of fear. The scream had come from the east wing. Julien, the footman, appeared at the top of the stairs, his eyes wide. Monsieur Poirot, Madame Duval. Poirot brushed past him. Madame Elise Duval lay sprawled on the floor of her private sitting room. A small writing desk had been overturned. Papers were scattered everywhere like fallen leaves. A porcelain lamp lay shattered, its cord torn violently from the wall. Madame Duval was alive, but barely. Her breathing came in shallow gasps. A thin line of blood trickled from her temple. Poirot knelt beside her at once. She was struck, he said sharply, from behind. Colonel Beaumont frowned. Is she? She lives, Poirot replied. But this time, the intention was not symbolic. Julien hovered anxiously. Monsieur, I heard voices, then the scream. Poirot looked up. How many? Julien hesitated. One, a man. Poirot closed his eyes briefly. So, he murmured, the warning has failed. We have progressed to desperation. Madame Duval was carried to her bed. The doctors still stranded in the house due to the snow-confirmed Poirot's fears. She was meant to be killed. He said gravely, another blow would have done it. Poirot thanked him and left the room quietly. In the corridor, the guests stood in uneasy silence. This is madness, Lucien Roche said hoarsely. Someone is trying to kill us one by one. No, Poirot corrected calmly. Someone is trying to force the truth. Colonel Beaumont's eyes burned. And who decides what truth is worth blood? Poirot met his gaze steadily. That, he said softly, is the question that damns men. Poirot gathered everyone in the grand salon once more. The Christmas tree still stood, its lights glowing faintly, mocking the darkness of the moment. No one leaves this room, Poirot announced. Not even to breathe. Roche scoffed weakly. You have no authority. Poirot's voice cut through him like steel. I have certainty. Silence fell. Poirot walked slowly around the room, his hands clasped behind his back. The first act, he said, was poison. A controlled act. A message. The second, he continued, was violence. Crude, emotional, a failure. He stopped behind Colonel Beaumont. The killer is losing control. Beaumont did not turn. Poirot turned instead toward Etienne Laurent. Monsieur Laurent, he said gently. Where were you when Madame Duval was attacked? Laurent swallowed. In my room, alone. Poirot nodded. Yes, and you were praying. Laurent stared at him. How could you, because guilt seeks absolution, Poirot replied. But guilt is not murder. He moved on. Monsieur Roche, Poirot said, you were near the east wing earlier. Roche's hands trembled. I was walking. I could not sleep. Poirot smiled faintly. Sleep avoids many men tonight. Roach opened his mouth to protest, but Poirot had already turned away. Poirot now faced Colonel Beaumont directly. "Colonel," he said quietly, "you believe in justice, yes? You believe some crimes deserve punishment beyond the law, yes? And you believe you are the man to deliver it?" Beaumont's voice was cold. "Someone must." Poirot nodded slowly. "Indeed. And so you planned a reckoning." The room seemed to shrink. "You poisoned Madame Moreau," Poirot continued. "Not to kill her, but to remind her of her past." Beaumont's jaw tightened. "You struck Madame Duval," Poirot went on, "because she stood between you and confession, because she would protect her husband." Beaumont laughed harshly. "You have no proof." Poirot smiled. "Not yet." That night, Poirot did something unexpected. He announced he would retire. "I am tired," he said calmly. "My little grey cells require rest." The guests stared at him in disbelief. "You cannot be serious," Roach said. Poirot bowed slightly. "On the contrary, I am very serious." He instructed Julian to extinguish most of the lights and wished everyone a quiet night. As Poirot closed the door of his room, a small smile touched his lips. "Now," he murmured, "we wait." The trap was simple and irresistible. Poirot placed the broken watch carefully on his bedside table, visible through the slightly open door. He ensured the threatening note lay beside it. Then he waited in. Darkness. Minutes passed. Then an hour. Footsteps crept softly along the corridor. Poirot's eyes opened. Shadow paused outside his door. A hand reached in, switched on the light. Colonel Beaumont stood frozen, the watch in his hand. Poirot's voice was combat triumphant. "Justice," he said softly, "has betrayed you, Colonel." Beaumont's shoulders sagged. "It was never enough," he whispered. "Fear was not enough." Poirot nodded sadly. "Revenge never is." From behind, Julian appeared, followed by the others. Drawn by the light dot, Beaumont dropped the watch. "I wanted her to confess," he said hoarsely. "All of them. I wanted them to feel what we felt." Poirot stepped forward. "And now," he said gently, "you will confess." Outside, police whistles echoed at last through the snowy Paris streets. Christmas bells rang again, but this time they sounded like judgment. Part 8. The past returns. The snow had stopped by morning, leaving the streets of Paris gleaming under the pale winter sun. Inside the Duval townhouse, the tension had shifted. No longer was there fear of immediate death. The second attempt had failed, and the true culprit had been revealed. Yet a heavier weight remained, the burden of history, secrets long buried that had resurfaced with deadly consequences. Poirot sat in the grand salon, hands clasped, staring into the dying embers of the fire. Colonel Beaumont had been restrained in a small study room, not as punishment, but to allow reflection. Poirot knew well that the mind of a man like Beaumont required careful handling. He was disciplined, meticulous, and dangerously cunning when cornered. "Now," Poirot murmured, "we must understand the root of this calamity." Monsieur Armand Duval and Madame Elise Duval were summoned. They entered hesitantly, their faces pale but composed, bracing for the inevitable confrontation with their past. Poirot gestured to the empty seats. "Let us speak plainly," Poirot began. "The events of Christmas Eve are but the final act in a play whose opening scene was set many years ago." He paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle over the room. Colonel Beaumont, you lived through the occupation of Paris. You bore witness to acts of betrayal and secrecy. Beaumont did not respond, his gaze fixed rigidly on the carpet. You knew lists were kept, Poirot continued. Lists that decided who would live and who would disappear. Beaumont's jaw tightened. That was war, and war does not ask questions. No, Poirot agreed, but memory does. And memory is a dangerous companion when mixed with obsession. He turned to Duval. Monsieur, your role in these lists. Your discretion allowed some to prosper, others to perish. Is that correct? Duval swallowed. Yes, he admitted. I protected certain individuals, and others were sacrificed. Precisely, Poirot said. And you, Madame Duval, were aware of this. You knew the names, the fates, and the consequences. Yes, she whispered. We were always aware. Poirot's gaze hardened. And so, Colonel Beaumont has come to exact a form of justice, personal justice. He believes that fear, humiliation, and threat are the proper responses to years of silence. Poirot rose and walked to the window. Staring out at the quiet street below Madame Moreau, he said softly, You were not just a witness, but an agent of influence. You held power, and in holding it, you made enemies. She met his gaze. Enemies, perhaps. But I only survived because I understood people, because I knew when to bend, when to manipulate. That is how we live in this world. Poirot nodded slowly. And yet, he said, you were spared not by your skill, but by the chaos you provoked. The poison, the second attempts were lessons, tests, and warnings. He turned to the assembled group. History is seldom silent. The past returns, often when we least expect it, and demands reckoning. The group sat in stunned silence. Even Colonel Beaumont's rigid composure had cracked slightly. He had been forced to confront not just his own actions, but the consequences of the decades-long shadows that had lingered over Paris. Poirot continued, walking slowly between them. You see, mise, amis, this is the nature of crime intertwined with history. It is not the act alone that matters, is the context, the cause, and the legacy. He stopped in front of Duval. You protected some, yes, but your choices have a price. Colonel Beaumont, your obsession with justice is understandable, but it has led you astray. Beaumont's voice was low, almost defeated. I only wanted some measure of fairness. Poirot's tone softened. And you have it now, Colonel, in understanding the truth. But your methods were flawed. Madame Moreau leaned back in her chair, finally recovering some of her strength. So this Christmas Eve disaster, she said weakly, was all because of the past. Indeed, Poirot replied. Old wrongs, old secrets, all converging in one night. And yet, it has allowed clarity, confession, and recognition. It is the peculiar justice of life, is it not? Julien, the young footman, spoke for the first time. Monsieur Poirot, if history has returned so violently, will it ever truly end? Poirot smiled faintly. Ah, Julien, history never ends. It merely waits, quietly, until it must speak again. As the day progressed, the Duvals and Madame Moreau shared what they could of their past, careful, measured accounts of war, betrayal, and survival. Colonel Beaumont listened, his rigid expression softening as he came to understand the human complexity behind what he had perceived as simple wrongdoing. Poirot, meanwhile, moved quietly among the group, observing, reflecting and calculating. The puzzle was not yet complete, not because the killer remained free, but because the human elements, the motives, the fears, the regrets still needed understanding. By evening, the mood had shifted subtly. The immediate threat had passed, the second attempt had failed, and Colonel Beaumont had begun to acknowledge the futility of revenge untempered by reason. Poirot stood by the window once more, looking out at the softly falling dusk. Paris was silent, save for the occasional distant bell. He mused, as he often did, on the nature of human behavior, how the past shapes the present, how secrets linger like shadows, and how even during the season of goodwill, darkness may stir unseen. This, he murmured to himself, is the true lesson of Christmas Eve. Part 9. The Christmas Eve revelation. The grand salon of the Duval townhouse was quietly tense that evening. A fire crackled low in the hearth, its warm glow flickering against the polished wood and ornaments of the Christmas tree. Outside, Paris glimmered under a thin blanket of snow, serene and oblivious to the darkness that had occupied this house for nearly 24 hours. Poirot stood at the head of the room, his posture immaculate, his gaze steady and unwavering. The assembled group, Madame Duval, Monsieur Duval, Madame Moreau, Lucien Roche, Etienne Laurent, and Colonel Beaumont watched him with a mixture of fear, curiosity, and grudging respect. Mes amis, Poirot began, his voice calm, yet carrying the weight of authority. We are gathered here tonight not to celebrate Christmas, though the season has not entirely abandoned us. We are gathered to uncover truth, and truth, as always, is more uncomfortable than fiction. He paused, allowing the gravity of his words to sink in. The events of Christmas Eve, Poirot continued, appear, on the surface, to be the work of chance or misfortune. But as we've discovered, nothing is accidental. Every gesture, every action, every seemingly minor detail has its place in the design of the crime. Poirot gestured to the items on the table, the broken watch, the empty vial, the threatening note, and the recovered document. These objects, he said, are not merely evidence, they are guiding us toward the mind of the perpetrator. But objects alone do not lie. It is the human element that must be read, the gestures, the hesitations, the small truths spoken in silence. He began with Madame Moreau. Madame Moreau, you drank from a poisoned glass, but you were not the intended victim. The poison was a warning, message designed to provoke fear and to force action. Her eyes widened slightly, and she nodded slowly. Yes, I understood. Exactly, Poirot affirmed. And yet, it was not you who committed the act. Nor, I assure you, did you conspire with anyone to do so. Turning to Lucien Roche, Poirot's gaze sharpened. Monsieur Roche, you handled the glass, yes, but not with murderous intent. Your crime was opportunistic, a theft, not a killing. You sought the document, and nothing more. Am I correct? Roche's hands twitched nervously. He could not deny the truth in Poirot's observation. Poirot then faced Colonel Beaumont. The room seemed to constrict as the Colonel's rigid composure began to falter. Colonel, Poirot said softly, you, of all present, bore the heaviest burden of history. You witnessed betrayal, loss, and injustice during the occupation. You believed you alone could administer justice, and so you devised a plan, first to warn, then to punish. Beaumont's jaw tightened. I only sought justice. only fairness. And in doing so, Poirot replied, you resorted to methods unworthy of the justice you claimed to serve. Poison, threats, and violence. You endangered innocence and manipulated fear to achieve your ends. Beaumont's shoulders slumped. I wanted them to feel what I felt. The fear, the uncertainty, the helplessness. And now you know, Poirot said, voice softening slightly, that fear alone is not justice. And that obsession can blind even the most disciplined mind. Poirot moved to the recovered document, lifting it carefully. This, he said, was the bait, the lure that drew attention and allowed the first act of poison to occur without raising immediate suspicion. Only the most observant could see its role, and only the cleverest, my little grey cells, could interpret the signals. He turned back to the group. Every act, every motion, every gesture you observed or performed was part of a chain. One small misstep could unravel it all. But one step also revealed the truth. Poirot gestured to the watch. The broken watch stopped at 11. That precise moment marked the first action, the poisoning. It was subtle, deliberate, and intended to appear as a mere accident. But time is impartial. It cannot lie, and neither, ultimately, can human behavior. Poirot's gaze fell on Etienne Laurent. Monsieur Laurent, you were fearful, yes, but you were not a participant in the criminal acts. You represent the ordinary victim of circumstance caught between power, greed, and history. Your fear served as a contrast to the true intentions of the perpetrator, illuminating the human element in the darkness. He paused, letting the significance of his words settle. Finally, Poirot addressed the room as a whole. The Christmas Eve disaster was not a single act. It was a carefully orchestrated series of provocations intended to reveal truth, punish, and provoke reflection. The poison, the attacks, the theft, all led to this moment: revelation, clarity, and the confrontation with conscience. Poirot's voice dropped to a whisper, yet it carried to every corner of the room. The perpetrator is present among us. Their identity is no longer hidden. They have been revealed by their own actions, their own compulsions, and their own choices. Justice is not achieved through concealment, but through recognition. And now, Poirot said, with a small smile, it must be acknowledged publicly. He paused, letting the silence grow. Every person in the room felt it, the weight of accountability, the inevitability of truth, and the power of reason over fear. Colonel Beaumont, Poirot said finally, you were the one who orchestrated the series of events that led to the poison. The attack on Madame Duval, and the terror that has gripped this house. You acted with purpose, with calculation, and with a sense of justice twisted into obsession. And now, he continued, raising a hand slightly, you will answer for it to the law. Beaumont's face betrayed a mixture of shame, relief, and resignation. He nodded, finally acknowledging the truth that had been hidden beneath layers of history and personal vendetta. The other guests, though shaken, felt a collective release. The threat had passed. The mystery had been solved. The intricate web of deception had been untangled. Poirot stepped back, allowing the group to absorb the resolution. Christmas is a time for reflection, he said quietly, and for truth. The past has returned tonight, but it has been confronted. The present has been clarified, and the future, he added with a slight smile, will be guided by the lessons learned in this house on this Christmas Eve. The fire crackled one last time, casting long shadows against the walls. Outside, The bells of Paris rang once more, this time signaling peace, justice, and the promise of a quiet Christmas morning. Poirot allowed himself a small sigh of satisfaction. Order had been restored, and the tangled threads of history, fear, and obsession had been meticulously untangled by nothing more than his intellect and his unerring little grey cells. Part 1 OA Quiet Christmas Morning. The first pale light of Christmas morning filtered through the tall windows of the Duval townhouse, casting a soft glow on the polished wood floors and the flickering remnants of last night's fire. Outside, Paris lay peaceful under a thin coat of snow, streets empty except for the occasional distant bell tolling across the rooftops. Inside, the atmosphere was calm but heavy with reflection. Hercule Poirot sat quietly at a small breakfast table, a cup of carefully prepared coffee before him. His posture was impeccable, his hands resting lightly on the table, and his eyes, though gentle, were sharp and calculating. The night's events had left their mark on everyone in the house, but to Poirot, the scene was one of resolution, not despair. Order had been restored. The chaos of the previous evening had been transformed into clarity. Colonel Henry Beaumont had been escorted to the local authorities under careful supervision. His restraint was necessary. His mind, still tense with obsession and remorse, had to be handled with care. The police would ensure that justice, tempered by law, would be applied. Monsieur and Madame Duval were seated nearby, their hands intertwined, their faces pale but composed. The recovery of the stolen document had lifted a considerable burden from their shoulders, though the memories it evoked remained raw. Madame Moreau, now fully conscious and recovering, had requested a private moment with Poirot. "I owe my life to you, Monsieur Poirot," she said quietly, her voice still faint but steady. "I cannot thank you enough." Poirot inclined his head slightly. "Madame, I did only what was necessary. It is not gratitude I seek, but understanding. Understanding of human behavior, of motives, and of consequence. You are fortunate, yes, but fortune favors those who observe carefully and, sometimes those who survive the fear." She smiled faintly. "Fear, indeed. I shall not forget this Christmas Eve." The breakfast was quiet, interrupted only by the soft clinking of cutlery. The servants moved silently, their efficiency a stark contrast to the events of the previous night. Julien, the young footman, had grown noticeably more confident after assisting Poirot in observing the small, crucial details that led to the discovery of the poison and the document. Poirot spoke softly, almost to himself, as he surveyed the room. "Christmas," he murmured, "is a time when the human heart is laid bare. Secrets are more dangerous when the world expects kindness, and lies thrive under the guise of festivity. Yet even in darkness, the light of reason can restore order. The little grey cells are patient, and they rarely fail." By mid-morning, the atmosphere had lightened slightly. Guests who had once been tense and suspicious were now relaxed, though still thoughtful. Conversation returned, cautiously at first, and then more freely. As they reflected on the events that had shaken the house, Monsieur Duval raised his cup. "To Hercule Poirot," he said warmly. "Without his brilliance, none of us would have survived the terror of last night." Poirot allowed himself a modest smile. "Merci, monsieur. But remember, it was not heroism that saved you, it was observation, analysis, and calm in the face of fear. Courage is valuable, yes, but it is intellect that prevails in such circumstances." Madame Moreau leaned forward, her eyes thoughtful. And the truth, she said softly, is sometimes harder to accept than fear itself. Poirot nodded. Indeed, Madame, truth is the most relentless force of all. Fear can hide it temporarily, but it always emerges in the end. By late morning, the police had completed their formalities. Colonel Beaumont had been taken quietly, his expression resigned, yet strangely relieved. Justice would be administered through legal channels, but the personal reckoning he had sought, the confrontation with those he believed had wronged him, had already occurred. Lucien Roche, Etienne Laurent, and the remaining guests began to prepare for their departure. The tension that had gripped the house for 2 nights was finally dissipating, replaced by a solemn understanding of the events they had endured. Poirot lingered by the window, watching the streets of Paris slowly come alive with pedestrians and the faint hum of carriages. The city seemed peaceful, oblivious to the shadow that had passed through one of its elegant townhouses. Finally, Poirot allowed himself a small, private moment of reflection. He sipped his coffee slowly, savouring the precise balance of flavours. The events of Christmas Eve had tested his skills, challenged his understanding of human nature, and reminded him of the delicate interplay between fear, ambition, and morality. Humans are strange creatures, he murmured. Even in times of celebration, they are capable of great deception and great courage. They are creatures of habit, of emotion, and of memory. The past is never truly past, and the present is fragile. But order, yes, order is always possible, if one is patient enough to see the threads and weave them together carefully. Julien appeared at the door. Monsieur Poirot, shall I prepare a light meal for you? Poirot smiled faintly. Yes, Julien, and let it be done with the precision that befits both nourishment and Christmas. The young footman bowed and left. Poirot returned to his thoughts, considering the subtle clues, the minute details, the way human behavior revealed truth through hesitation, panic, and silence. Outside, Paris celebrated Christmas in quiet joy, unaware of the darkness that had been averted within one townhouse. Inside, Poirot savoured the calm, knowing that for this season, at least, order had been restored. As he sat by the window, sipping coffee and reflecting, Poirot allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. The little grey cells had triumphed once again. And so, as the first snowflakes of Christmas Day melted under the soft Parisian sun, the Devol townhouse, its occupants, and the city beyond could breathe freely. The mystery had concluded. The culprit was apprehended, the stolen document recovered, and Hercule Poirot, ever vigilant, had ensured that justice and reason prevailed, even amid the shadows of the past. The end.